Today we are talking about mid-adventure session prep, specifically about when you're prepping for sessions in the middle of an adventure that you're already in. Right, we're talking about prepping for an adventure you're already in, and how that differs obviously from full-on one-shot adventure prep, and how you can be successful in that prep without feeling like you're trying to start a new adventure in the middle of an adventure that you already have going on. What are some of the stumbling blocks in other prep advice? And that includes my own. I'm certainly guilty of this own thing. It's very easy to talk about session prep from an aspect when you're starting, when you don't know that person's situation, who you're talking to, trying to give advice and trying to figure out what they need for their game. It's very easy to assume that they don't have anything going on. And the unfortunate thing is that that's sort of a failed premise because it assumes that you're always planning a new adventure when you're doing your session prep. Which is basically the same as doing a one-shot creation or a short adventure creation and session prep all rolled into one. And that's not usually the case. Now, is it? I don't know about your experience, but my experience sort of running games is that my games are not sort of a series of one session one-offs. And so I can't prep using that same sort of methodology. I can't I think we know that so many advices that start with, hey, do you want to run D&D or Pathfinder or whatever? And the first thing you need to do is go grab yourself like a 5-room dungeon or a short map from somebody like Dyson's Logos, or a one-page dungeon, something like that. Or at the very minimum, if you're pretty much creating a whole cloth, usual advice is like go find a map, grab a map, and then start filling the map out, right? Basically, you're grabbing a dungeon, the framework of a dungeon, and then you're just putting the guts in it. And as somebody who doesn't run campaigns that are just like linear one shot, that's not useful advice, because whenever I'm prepping in between sessions, I'm already in the middle of adventure. I'm not trying to start a new adventure in the middle of that adventure. Right? That's adventure creation and prep, and I talk about that separately from necessarily session prep. And I think we should talk about it separately from necessarily session prep. Because there's so much about session prep that's about trying to tie together all the loose ends of what's going on in an ongoing adventure and trying to figure out, okay, this is the situation. I'm trying to figure out what my players are going to do in the next session and try to have something ready for them and trying to start to sort of filter them towards what we think the natural end of that adventure is going to be, or dungeon, or whatever it is. Now, the nice thing is that if you're prepping a dungeon, this is way easier. If you are running just a straight up dungeon delve, you're gonna have those guts. You're gonna have the framework of that dungeon. That's one of the reasons there's so much advice, especially for new dungeon masters and game masters around. You should run dungeons, and I know that's not super popular for 5th edition DMs, or by that I mean dungeon masters or game masters that are new to 5th edition or are coming into the hobby now, and they look at that. There are so many adventures that people want to run that are not inside a dungeon. But one of the reasons that so much advice for new dungeon masters or game masters is filtered towards a dungeon is because a dungeon is so constrained, which makes it very easy to hold a lot of it in your head, but also it limits a lot what the player characters are able to do in that aspect, and what the players can decide to do. So if you're prepping in the middle of a dungeon, sure, they might be like, well, we decide that we're going to abandon this adventure, and we're going to make it all the way out of the dungeon, and we're going to trek half a continent away to check out some random thing that you said along the way that they have decided to focus on, and that's not important to the game, but now I guess you're going to make it important to the game because that's what they decided to focus on. So we're going to follow their interest because they are the main characters. But that's, even when you're doing that, even if that happens and you're just prepping a dungeon, nice thing is that it starts from where they are. Then you know that they still have to make it back out of the dungeon, which is probably going to take depending on how far they are in, that's already going to take most of the the upcoming session for them to sort of extricate themselves from that dungeon, because you can do random encounters, you can do traps and hazards and all that stuff, and once they get out and then do some sort of encounters on the road and things like that, it's very easy to sometimes what we call play for time, sort of pad that content to get yourself to prep. And I think that is the main goal of any session prep, is that you are trying to figure out enough content to fill the actual game session based off of what you think the players are going to do, the choices you think your players are going to make. And that's always a crapshoot. But if you have enough resources and enough sort of improvisation aids, you're able to sort of fill up the session as needed to get you to the point where you can prep again. And that's once you get prep again and you get direction from them, you know where they're going to go, and then you can plot out things along that path. So that's really important. And that kind of brings us to where we're going to talk about first. And that's going to be beginning at the end. So, beginning at the end, what do we mean? There's basically 3 questions that we kind of need to talk to people about. Or questions, 3 points for the end of every session. So, session prep truly begins at the end of the previous session. And that's especially important for these sort of mid-adventure session preps. So, you have your question. You have your countdown timers. And I've gone over some of this before, but of course, if you guys have any questions about any of this stuff, the countdown timers is something I talk about in my 2d6 tables video, I think. No, sorry, the resource die video. I'm thinking of the wrong thing. The resource die video. I talk about it there because it uses the same framework as the resource die, and our summary. But the first thing is to sort of begin at the end of that session when you're in that mid-adventure. If you're, right in the middle of an adventure and you need to know, okay, what are my players going to do next? Ask them. Ask them is usually a good start. So you ask them, and you kind of, by asking them, you're trying to force them to sort of make a choice about what their intentions are for the next session. And that's really the most important thing, is we got to ask our question. What are you guys doing next? And make sure you get a resolute answer. Make sure they understand the weight of that answer, too. You talk to them and you let them know, hey, I'm asking this question so I know what to prep for the next session. So tell me what you guys are prepping for the next session, and then that's the choice your characters have made. That is where you're going. That's what you're going to do. And then when the next session actually comes up, try not to let them weasel out of that decision. Or if they do, make sure that they're aware. It's like, hey, just so you know, you told me you were going to do X, so I prepped things for X, and now you're telling me that you want to do Y. So I'm just letting you know, I don't have really stuff prepared for that, because you told me you were going to do this. Are you sure that you're not going to do this, and you are going to do that? We can do that. Well, that's going to be up to you as a dungeon master. For me, that's usually like, yes, we can do that, but I'm just letting you know, like, I haven't prepped that stuff, so it's going to be a little wonky. Maybe a little wonky. It's going to be highly improvised if we're going to do that instead. And especially if we're not going to do that. Right, if we're not going to do the thing that you said you're going to do, I might need to take a break at the beginning of the session and be like, all right, give me a minute, let me figure out what this is going to look like. Talks amongst yourselves, and I'll take care of that and figure it out. So that's sort of the angle that I try to come at it from. So right, your group said at the end you were headed west to the barrow field, so that's what I prepped. And if you guys aren't going to do that, then I'm going to figure out some other things. This is one of the cases why I have, it's packed up in my bag because I just got back from a game, but my DM binder in that back folder is what I call the parachute file, where I have sort of what we talked about at the top, about sort of that, the advice for the sort of session prep usually comes with, grab a one-sheet adventure, or grab a 5-room dungeon, or something of that nature, some sort of small one-shot. And in that parachute file, I keep about 1 to 3 sort of short adventures like that are pre-published or I've made beforehand, whichever the case is. So often it's a mix of both, and they're sort of I make them based on sort of their level, but also the sort of biome or area location that they're in. So that way I can give them something to run into whenever they decide to go way off the rails and do that stuff. So that's really useful for me, and that's definitely one of the advice that I would share with a lot of people is like, hey, maybe go check that out. Check out doing something like that, because I have found it really, really useful. As a, hold on, there we go. I found that really, really useful to be like, to give me a sense of comfort that I'm prepared, especially when my players are like, we're gonna go way, way afield, way far afield, and we're not gonna follow the thing that we said we were gonna do. So it's up to you to just sort of make it up on the fly, and that's just, yeah, prep encounters, not story, except the things you cannot change. Yeah. The thing about it is, if you're in the middle of an adventure, hopefully that story, you already kind of know what that story is. But yeah, you can't necessarily prep, you don't necessarily want to prep like a linear script encounter, because that is very rarely going to survive contact with your players. You definitely don't want to go around trying to force a story, trying to force them into some sort of narrative. It usually does not work, unless you have very, very compliant players. And some DMs too. Some DMs or game masters try to build groups that do that for them. But yeah, in general, you're definitely not one to try to prep a bunch of stories. Alright, so we talked about the question, so that's number one. Ask that question, what are you guys doing next? So that way I know what to prep along that path. So we can have a good session, basically. Second one is countdown timers. This is really something for me that's more of a somewhat of a more ongoing campaign thing, but also can be an adventure thing. And that's all it is. The countdown timers is all they do is they measure consequences of actions, and that's both good and foul, you know, depending on what they do. So if they make a decision to screw somebody over, there's always a chance with the countdown timer that person's going to come back and you know, they're gonna get the karma from it. It's kind of like a karma die. And if they're very helpful to somebody, there's a chance that that's going to aid them later on in the adventure or campaign. And so at the end of every session, after I ask the questions, I have a sort of a countdown die. It uses the resource die mechanic, so if you are interested in how that works, go check out that video on the resource die, and that'll cover everything. I actually talk specifically about countdown timers in it. So basically it's just a great way to try to make sure that it kind of curtails a little bit of murder hoboism a little bit, and it gives you a little bit more immersion for the players into the world. It's like, hey, by the way, you guys did, you know, X, Y, or Z, and now one of those things, depending on what you have done, has now come back up in your face. And so that's a good way to sort of inject a little chaos, which can be both beneficial chaos or detrimental chaos for your players, depending on how they play the game, right? Which is very fun. And then number 3 is just my summary. So I like to do recaps about as soon to the end of the session as possible. Certainly if I'm playing sort of like a virtual game, it's likely that I'm going to do the recap of the session probably right after we stop the game. If I'm playing an in-person game, which usually means that I'm usually traveling, I'm usually not hosting, so I'm usually traveling to someplace. I come back, I might not want to do it if it's like midnight and I just get home. It's like I'm probably not gonna do the recap then. I'm gonna wait probably until the next day. But usually as soon as I can after the session is over, I want to try to capture the recap, while everything that's went on in the session is still really fresh in my mind. And it's just a bullet point list for the most part, just kind of detailing. It's like, hey, this is what everything that happened in the previous session. And it's just basically a bullet point list to double check my memory and their memory when it comes for game time next time, because usually that's how I open up the next session. Is usually I'll have somebody else recap, but I'll also go have the bullet point list in front of me of my own recap to make sure that they remember something that's important, or to correct them if they've misremembered something, or also to take notes if they have completely misinterpreted something or have completely gone far afield. And then I know for myself whether that's session prep for next time, or something that I need to change in what we're about to do in this session that we're just starting to run, so I can make some amendments to try to make sure everything works correctly. Just trying to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page about what we're going to be doing during the session. So yeah, that's the first thing. And that's, like I said, all of this is done right at the end of the session. Or, so these are, 1 and 2 are done, well, one's certainly done at the end of the session. It's usually the last thing as we sort of finish up, asking the question, what are you guys, given what's happened right now, what are you guys doing next? So that way I know if there's some sort of choice to make, that I know where they're going to go, or what they're searching for. Even if they're in a dungeon, figure out, what specifically are you guys searching for? Are you guys looking for, I don't know, a way across a chasm that they've come across already? If they're looking for, they're going to return to the puzzle room to try to figure out that puzzle. Are they going to, are they searching for the BBEG that's deeper in the layer somewhere? Are they looking for the, they're going to follow the goblin footprints that they found and the droplets of blood? They're going to follow that. So if they just give me some sort of idea, even when it's inside a dungeon, I have an idea. It's like, okay, so they're probably going to follow this path of the dungeon, so these are probably the rooms I need to focus on prepping the most. And then if they get to the other stuff, then we'll do what we can. But really just to make sure that those first, specifically that first scene's going to be really, really tight and really, really good for them to have that very strong start feel. And that works for adventures that are not in the dungeon as well. So if they're in town, let's say they had they just picked up the last session, we finished one adventure and they picked up a quest line for something else, and they're about to set out from town, and I'm like, okay, well, you guys have some different irons in the fire, so you tell me what is the thing you're going to go after next. Which is the thing that your player characters feel motivated to go after. We have, the rumor of the lost treasure. We have player 2's sister sent him that letter and about some sort of issues at home. Are you guys going to go check that out now? Are you going to let that lie? Or are you guys going to head to 2 towns to the north to collect your bounty from this last adventure, to collect your prize from this quest? Or are you going to do that? Are you guys going to do that later? So that sort of thing, sort of figure out, all right, you guys are at a decision point. Where are you going next? And so that way I know, well, I'm not going to prep the stuff for you guys to go pick up the adventure bounty if you guys decided that actually we really need to go check on that player character's sister. We think that's the most pressing issue. I'm like, all right, well, that's the thing I'll prep then. And so that just helps me sort of take prep, which can be like when you sit down for a session and be like, it could be anything. But again, at that point we're talking more about sort of that standard adventure prep in between adventures kind of feel. But it can also feel like mid-adventure prep if they had already started, kind of kicked off that quest line with the sister and things like that. Or especially if it's not sort of the first encounter with the sister, if this is maybe the second or third encounter with the sister, there's sort of an ongoing storyline. I might need to go back to my old notes and check out, okay, what's going on with the sister again? Because we haven't touched on that in like 6 sessions, so what was that again? And figure all that out. So that's really it. It's sort of begin at the end. So session prep for me begins at the end of that session and doing that. And making sure we get that session summary or recap done as quickly as possible once I'm done, while it's still very fresh in my mind and I can still think about everything they did, or all the conversations that sometimes that's not what we talk about very often in sort of session prep or adventure creation or anything like that. It's important to take breaks and not force yourself against sort of a grindstone and kind of feel like, well, I've got to do it right now. Or especially, I know, at least for me, after I run a game or even play games, and the session's ending, I get home, I still have, like, I'm still amped up from the session. I'm like, oh, well, I want to start doing the prep right now. Like, actually, I found out, certainly for me, that it's actually better if I take a break a little bit. So take a day, take a day or two, kind of sit back and let that adventure. We got the session prep notes done really early, and that's so I don't have to worry about losing that information in my mind. I can instead sort of sit back and let our brains do what it do what they do best, which is to let information sort of percolate within it. And as that information sort of percolates, we naturally figure things out. It's the same reason people tend to have important thoughts when they're in the shower or while they wake up from sleep. It's that our brain does a lot of sort of background work that our subconscious does, that we're not really sometimes very aware of. So it's nice to give it that time and then give it that space, and often it will come up with ideas for your prep. And so it's really nice to take. I like to try to take. Let's say if I was going to run a game. Say I was running a game on Fridays. I would probably take Friday and I come home, and then if I had enough time, depending on what time it is, I might do the recap. If not, I might do that on a Saturday, whenever I have the chance, early enough. And then I usually wait and do my session prep probably on like a Tuesday or Wednesday. Like, give myself a few days to kind of have some time. And now, of course, it kind of depends on your schedule. Obviously, when you have time to prep is when you're going to have to prep. But usually it's sort of the middle of the week. I find it a nice sort of like evening activity to kind of sit down and work on the prep for the next session. After I've had a few days, I can look back at the recap, remind myself of what's going on, think about any of the ideas that I've had in that time. Obviously, if I have ideas, if I have those shower thoughts or those ideas that wake me up from sleep or when I'm watching TV or whatever it is, and just jot them down and place them to the side wherever you prep, and then place it with your prep material, so that way when you have your prep materials, you can bring it up and be like, oh, right, I wanted to do this, this, and this. Do I still want to do that now that it's a few days later? Yeah, no, I still like that idea. And then sometimes I'll be like, I actually, that now that I think about it for more than 2 seconds, I'm not sure that's a great idea. I'm not gonna use that. So yeah, it's important to take breaks. You gotta let your brain work. Let your subconscious. You gotta let your subconscious stew on it. Stew on the material. When you're prepping. Especially in a mid-adventure, when you're thinking about, okay, what are things that have happened up to this point in the adventure? What are things that we think are going to happen in the coming sessions of this adventure, depending on how long the adventure is. For a multi-part adventure, it could be anywhere from 2 sessions to... depending on what sort of adventure you're running, it could be easily 6 to 8 sessions. All we gotta do is take a look at the solo RPG, the stuff that I've run with Leah, and we've run 3 sessions in the dungeon already, in the current dungeon, and we're about, 60% through? I thought it was going to be a much shorter dungeon, but we are taking a very long time. I thought we'd zip through it pretty quick, but we keep running into combat encounters. Which is not bad, but it does slow the game down a lot. So that's important to remember while you're doing prep, is the combat is usually the thing that takes the longest. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, we want to make sure that we take our break. We're going to let our subconscious sort of stew on that material before we come back to it. Let's say... yeah, I guess that's mainly the point. I thought I had another bullet point over here, but it's all talking about the same stuff in my notes that I have. And just writing down the notes, it says, taking walks are a great idea too. Any sort of physical exercise. There are a lot of studies now that actually talk about sort of not just our mental health, but also sort of like the hard science of like how well our brain functions is surprisingly more tied to our physical well-being than necessarily our mental well-being. Well, that's not exactly what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that physical exercise actually, and time outside, of course, and sunlight and fresh air and all that stuff is actually really, really good for our brains. Surprisingly more than what other things that we thought are really good for our brains, especially as we study more about people and sort of as how they age. We learn now that you'll see a lot of advice used to be around, well, you should do, when you're getting older, you should do crosswords and Sudoku and puzzles and stuff like that to help keep your mind sharp as you age. And a lot more sort of recent research has come out and been like, actually, it's as important, if not significantly more important, that you stay physically active, that you're that your body, you don't let your body sort of waste away, because that actually tends to have a more of an impact as to the functions of your brain than necessarily, keeping it fit with something like crosswords or puzzles or mental engagement of that facet. Is that physical exertion is actually really, really important. So if you have the ability to get some physical exercise in between when you run your session and when you prep your session, it's really helpful. Get outside, try to get some sunshine. If you can get some nature, depending on where you live, try to do that. Touch some grass, as the saying goes. Touch some grass, because all that stuff is really, really helpful. And let's see, taking a break. Yeah, that's pretty much it. And don't worry about the details. That's why we wrote down the stuff. That's why we do the session recap and summary early on, so that way we don't have to burden ourselves with remembering things. Don't about forgetting info. That's why we do the session summary. That's it. So yeah, it's really important to sort of, I find it's really important. It has helped my session prep a whole lot to just not try to do all the D&D or whatever it is all at one time. To go from playing the game to immediately prepping for the next session. That's too much sort of exertion on my brain, I find. Even though like I feel motivated to do it, but my brain's like, I need a minute, man. I need like give me some recovery in between your D&D. Like give me some hours, give me a sleep cycle. Let me reset so I can come back at this fully juiced. So we're taking a break. We're not procrastinating. And there's a big difference between those two things. Just the same way you don't want to do the session prep right before, I also find it useful to not do the session prep right at the end of your last session. You also don't really want to do it right before the next session. You really don't want to put like a whole bunch of extra stress on it. So if you can avoid procrastination, I know everybody struggles with that in some different ways. And I feel pretty blessed that I'm not a huge procrastinator in general. Sometimes, right? It kind of depends on what it is, but usually for things, especially things like prepping, I don't really procrastinate on it because I enjoy the prep. And I think that's one of the things to really sort of really helpful skill to learn as a game master of any kind is to find a way to enjoy your own prep, to enjoy prepping. Because if you can find a way to make it enjoyable, then you're not going to put it off, you're not going to not do it. You're going to actually start to kind of look forward to it. I actually like prepping games, and so because I like prepping games, then I am always motivated to do it. Like I said, I have more of a struggle being like, stopping myself from prepping right after a session rather than waiting until the very last minute to prep. So, but that's, it's gonna be different for everybody. So you may struggle with it the other side, where you may feel wiped after a session and you don't want to think about it until it's the day of. You keep kind of pushing it off because maybe you don't like prep. And that's perfectly reasonable. Nobody really likes homework, right? And that's sort of what you're doing as a dungeon master, is that if you come at session prep thinking about it as, this is my homework for the next game, and nobody else has to do homework, and you get yourself into that mindset, it can be not helpful for you to actually do the thing that you need to do for the session. So it's helpful to find a place, try to find the aspect of prep that you enjoy, or the parts of the game that you enjoy the most, and focus on doing that first. That can be really helpful. Figure out, well, if you really like building monsters, then maybe this is the time where you focus on sort of encounter building, and maybe you're going to make like one random monster, one custom monster to go with it because you kind of like monster building. Right, if that gets you to do your prep for combat encounters you think are going to happen, then go for it if that's what it's going to do. And it doesn't take too long. If you it's probably not useful to try to build custom monsters for every single encounter that you think are going to come up in an adventure. That's a lot of time. It's much easier to sort of take a similar already existing monster and reskin it a little bit, swap out some of its traits, do something like that, and that'll still hopefully give you enough of that creativity spark that you feel engaged with the prep and you're going to keep going with the prep without being like, well, I need to sit down and take whatever it takes, 30 minutes to an hour to make a custom engaging creature from scratch. It's going to be of appropriate CR, and especially if you're going to have to make more than one per encounter, that can be not super useful. So yeah, like I said, I like to do my session prep about 2 to 3 days before the game. That's, for me, has been the sweet spot. I'm sure you try it, you'll find your own sort of cadence with it, your own sort of tempo that'll make sense for you, but this is the one that kind of works best for me, is to kind of take some time, then do the prep, and then kind of take some time after. So that way I can check it back over once, reread it to make sure I was like, hey, did I forget something really important? Because, you know, sometimes that happens. And I'd rather find out about that before the game than during the game. Be like, oh, I have completely forgotten this encounter, or this important NPC, or I forgot to do anything about, you know, the item that's supposed to be in this dungeon. I completely forgot about it. So you don't want that, so I like to give myself an opportunity to check it back again at the end. So you don't want to procrastinate if yeah, it gives me a full day usually to add or revise. Full day. Let's say full day plus. To add, revise, or even remove content from the next session. So that's just helpful for me. It also gives me time, like, hey, if I remember, gives me an opportunity to check in with the player. So if we use that example that I said about the player characters got that ledger and they're going off to check on player 2's sister. This was the opportunity, okay, I've done the next session prep. Alright, they're going to be, most of this session I think is going to be on the road, so I've got some road encounters for them to run into and things that they can check out. And if they go fairly far afield, you know, I've got my little parachute file. I'd be like, okay, here's some random adventure locations that couldn't happen alongside a road as they're traveling through this terrain that they can get sidetracked with. If they decide to get sidetracked, then I have something that I can very quickly grab, look at, and run for them for a full session and some sort of side misadventure. But if I know that's the prep and I know that's where they're going, this is my opportunity, and I've prepped that, it's my opportunity to sort of check in with that player too and be like, hey, this is the stuff that we talked about kind of going on with your sister and your backstory as the relationship, and this is maybe some extra things you can intuit from the letter you received, or let's talk about maybe a specific type of adventure that you want to see or don't want to see based off of your own backstory. Like, do you want this to be you want it to be like a kidnapping thing? Do you want it to be sort of like a sibling tied up in some sort of like underground dealings and they're in over their head? Do you want it to be something terrible's happened to somebody in the family? Trying to figure out what sort of adventure type do they want, or what sort of thing do they need help with that's going to make sense for both the player character and the world that you run and the type of game that you run, but also is one that's going to be fulfilling sort of for everybody at the table, especially for this one player who we're focusing in on them. So we want to make sure that they have at least some say in kind of what's going on, so they feel like it's a fulfilling adventure arc, I guess is the best way to put it. It's going to be a fulfilling adventure for them, so it's going to focus on the specific type of adventure stuff that they like, because it's the stuff that's geared specifically towards them. So yeah, that's sort of it for procrastinating. And then let's go down here. Now we're going to really get into it. So the prep day is here. It's for me in our example, like, that's Wednesday, let's say. So what should I do? So let's talk about sort of high value versus low value prep. So what do you guys think high value versus and low value prep is? You probably have an idea of where I sit on that based off of what we've kind of talked about already in this video, but maybe not. So I think that I think it's very easy, especially for newer dungeon masters. And I was just watching a recent interview, I guess. I don't know. It's not really a podcast. I guess interview with DM's Lair and Sly Flourish, McShay. And one of the things that they talked about, sort of focusing on prep, it's just a snippet of that conversation. Really great video, by the way. Definitely go watch it. Especially, it's got a lot of cool WotC news. It's got a lot of sort of information about what it means to be sort of a creator and publisher in that sort of D&D ecosystem. If you want to understand like why things are the way they are, they talk about some of the new D&D 2024 stuff, some of that sort of industry news and things that are going on with other companies, conventions, etc. All that stuff. So it's a really great video if you just want to get some not basic knowledge, but just want to stay sort of at current events, updated. You want to have a broader perspective of the hobby and everything that goes on in it. I'd definitely say go check that out. But they talk about this a little bit, and they're very much sort of in the same rhythm that I am, as I think a lot of experienced dungeon masters are. That I think it's very easy to fall into prep trap with low value prep for new dungeon masters. And what do we talk about when we mean sort of low value prep? So things that they're flashy, but they don't help you guide or manage a session. I'm just gonna say D&D but it's the same for everybody. So what are those sorts of things? And instead, this is something that I would say these are I have time. The things that I would file under if I have time prep materials. They're really if I have time prep materials. And examples of that would be music, sound effects, really anything that's sort of like ambiance focused, dynamic lighting on maps. Often I say maps in general. I play a lot of theater of the mind combat and dungeons where I don't really focus a lot on the full dungeon mapping. I watched another video recently talking about dungeon mapping, and they were kind of coming at it from the angle of why it's a part of the game, and is sort of an old school content creator, and kind of talking about why it's a part of the game and how it can be fun. And actually, I don't think they even addressed that in the video, how it can be fun. I think they just talk about different methods of doing mapping. When, in truth, it's like the reason that I don't include it most of the time is that I can barely get players, and I think most DMs are in this boat, we can barely get players to take notes. You want to get somebody, like, contemporary D&D players barely take notes, and you want one of them to actually accurately map a dungeon, and how much time it takes to be like, here are the dimensions of the room, here's exactly where the exits are, so you have the appropriate information that your character would, with their eyes and ears actually looking at the place. And how little, at least for me, that impacts most games. Like, it's not super useful for most games. Like, it doesn't, at the end of the day, it's flashy, right? All that stuff looks really great. To have the dynamic lighting on the maps, are all beautiful, all look great. But are not something that I would say are particularly useful for actually guiding or managing a D&D session. That's why I'm like, I feel like these are very much if I have time prep materials, not the things I should be focusing on first. So that's going to be anything from you're making scenes, you're going to mean maybe you want a uh, random encounter table of monsters, that sort of stuff. That stuff is all things that are going to be more useful for managing and guiding the session. So if you want to make sure that another one that's up here that I didn't have out, something like handouts. Another good one. Any sort of tactile resources. Those are fun, and I love to include those things, but it's not. That's something I do at the end of my prep, not at the beginning of my prep. It's a, like I said, if I have time, prep material. If I have extra time, if it didn't take me long to do my session prep, if I prepped earlier in the week, just because that's when the time allowed, and then I had some free time, and I'm just revisiting it and be like, oh, it'd be really nice to have like a letter written up that I could give to the players, and I could do some like tea staining or something on the page. Sure, I'll do that. That'll be fun. And I have the time to do it, then I'll do that. But that shouldn't be like at the front loading my prep. That shouldn't be like, well, I can't do anything else in my prep until I write and tea stain a letter handout for my players. Because if that's all I get done in my prep, they're just going to have a letter, and now I have to improvise every single other thing in the session. I'd rather have at least that random encounter table more than anything else. I can improv, I can riff what I think the letters should be on the letter. That's not a big deal. But if I don't have anything prepared for like anything that they're going to actually do during the session, that's going to be more difficult on myself, and I'm not trying to make things harder on myself. Prep should be making our lives easier, not more complicated. And so, yeah, I mean, that's it. Session prep, that's the meat and potatoes. So really want to do, so what should you actually focus on? So what is sort of that high value prep? What do we actually mean by that? So for me, that means sort of challenges, scenes, encounters, whatever you kind of want to call that, is to, and just like Chad pointed out earlier, encounters, prepping those, like that's sort of the meat and potatoes. And so that's especially important for like a mid-adventure, is that if you've done your step one correctly and you've gotten the question and been like, okay, they're going in X direction, so I'm going to prep session what I think are going to be encounters that are going to be along that path to what they're trying to accomplish in the next session, or at least what they think that they're trying to accomplish. So that's what we're looking at. So let's say scenes, encounters, challenges, whatever you want to call them. That's what it's like. That's one sort of sandbox vignette diorama. Like, this is the scene that we want to focus on. This is the important thing that we think is going to happen. So the important thing is, these are going to be the most likely to happen. The players given choice of direction. If we've asked our questions and we listen to our players, they're going to tell us what they want for the next session. Then we know what to prep. Instead of trying to figure out, okay, they are here, they're at this one singular point, and I'm trying to prep everything in sort of like a circumference around them that's within a certain radius, to be like, well, if they make one decision, they'll go off in this path, one decision, they'll go off in this path, and one decision, they'll go off in this path. Instead of having to focus on doing everything that's in this sort of giant arc of what we think they might go to, if I can get them to choose one path, then it kind of becomes more, not fully linear as in a railroad, but more like, okay, here's a start point, here's an end point of where they're trying to get to, and now I just got to fill out the middle bits of things that they can run into, the most likely things that I think they're going to run into, and that's what we want to focus on. What's most likely to happen. Most of your session prep time should be spent on focusing on making a good starting scene. This is important. Let's talk about the starting scene. All right. So what is a strong start for the session? It is something that gets the players immediately into the action of what's kind of going on in the session. It's very easy to start a session when you have that strong start, when everybody's sort of sitting around the table and talking, be like, all right, we're going to get started. And then it's hard to transition fully into the game if you're like, well, everybody's just sitting around in a tavern or something like that. And so you just go from an out-of-character conversation to an in-character conversation, and then those lines get real blurry. So it can be more important to like really make a strong distinction between, okay, the game has started now with that strong start, and be like, give them something to immediately do. It can be a combat, it can be a exploration challenge, it can be a social challenge, it can be a conversation, but it needs to be a very sort of like pointed conversation that they're having. It needs to be something that they need to deal with immediately. Some pressing matter they have to address. The great thing about the strong start is that it allows you as DM to also sort of cut out a lot of the boring middle stuff. So like if we said we're following that adventure with player 2's got the sister, we're traveling to go there, instead of being like, okay, well you guys, let's do a little shopping, starting off with a shopping where you guys buy some supplies and stuff and decide to head out on the road, we could jump to whatever we think that first encounter on the road should be. That's our one time as a dungeon master that we get to, or any sort of game master, that we get to determine what's going to happen in the game. Is that at the very, very start, we get our only choice that we get to make as to what the player characters are actually going to, and players are actually going to do during a session, is right at the beginning of the session, because we're the one that gets to start the game. So instead of focusing on all that sort of shopping and walking aspect, we can jump right to whatever I prepped as the first road encounter. Let's say the first thing that we come across is an overturned wagon, and the classic. Actually, this does it really well. Is Mine of Fandelver. Is that you really kind of start that adventure off running into the goblin ambush. Sure, we give you some backstory about everything that's happened up to that point, but really that's where the game starts. So you can just start the game there, and you can start your sessions there in that same way. You come across an overturned wagon and 2 dead horses in the road that have arrows sticking out of them. That's all you need to do to start your session. Be like, you guys have been walking, and without fail, one of your players will be like, whoa, I wanna buy something in town. And you're like, yes, you can. You had time to resupply, so you guys had the player's handbook, you open it up to the adventuring gear, you spend the gold, you buy your stuff. All that stuff's available. There's no need for us to focus on that in the session. That's not really important. Let's get straight into what's happening. Let's get into that meat and potatoes of the game session. You guys have done all that stuff. That was all off-screen stuff. That's like writing like movies or television or book stories. It's like we don't need to focus on the characters using the bathroom. We assume the characters use the bathroom, and it's not important to the story that's kind of going on. We don't want to focus on that. We want to focus specifically on sort of our action stuff. So we're going to drive right to that matter. So, right, you only have control over that first scene, really. So you want to make sure that it's a nice, strong scene, that they immediately have something to do. So if we start off on the thing, they're like, all right, we're obviously in immediate danger. There's already been an attack. Are these people alive? Do we want to get out and check the wagon? Are the horses blocking the road? Can we get around them? Yes or no? And what they do, they kind of go from there. But immediately they're making decisions and they're doing stuff. And that's what we want to focus on. We can go from, all right, we're going to get the game started. You guys are going down the road. You guys have left whatever town. And now you're here. As you're coming around the bend of the road, you see that there's an overturned wagon that looks broken and a horse that was drawing it that has arrows sticking out of it and is clearly dead. What do you do? So we can jump right to that point. And then let them do, if there's stuff that they wanted to do in town that was not like shopping or something that's actually going to be kind of important, we can actually do that after the first scene. Let's say that the character wanted to talk to somebody in town, that there's been some sort of relationship that was about the adventure they were finishing or whatever it was. And they're like, actually, I really need to have a conversation with this NPC or something. Or we wanted to, it can even be like, oh, as we were resting last night, I wanted to have my player character wanted to have a very specific conversation with that player character. It's like, cool, well, let's finish this fight, and then we'll do a little flashback, and we'll talk about what happened with you guys last night before you guys went to bed. Easy way to handle it, so that way it doesn't interrupt, like, stop what you're trying to do. They still get that strong start, and then they can do the little flashback. They can take care of that, and then you can jump right back into the action again. Kick it off. It's our first scene. Make sure that they're making choices, It's like I said, it's okay to skip through any of the boring content. Like that stuff's not important. If the ranger or whoever it is like, oh, I wanna look for forage while we're walking. Sure, you can look for forage while we're walking, but that's not an important scene that we really need to focus on. We'll do that. Give me a roll. Did you find some forage? Yes or no? Yes. There you go. You found enough to resupply a day or two of rations. Or if they're looking for medicinal herbs or something like that, something similar. Right? They're not necessarily always looking for food. They could be foraging for all sorts of things. Let's see. You only get to control the first scene. Let me get down here. Yeah, I wrote myself just a little example. We can go over this example too. But let's say the players decided they wanted to investigate the ruined mill. Maybe that's one of the things where they're sort of not necessarily in between. Maybe they've got sort of like an ongoing adventure, but they've come back to town and they're like, man, we're going to pick up a little side thing that, they told you're kind of in the middle of an adventure, but they were like, hey, actually, while we're in town, we did last time we were here, the NPCs told us a rumor about sort of a ruined mill nearby. We can just, and that's kind of what we want. We just want to go check it out. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time there, but we do want to go check it out and be like, okay, well, that's what we'll do for next session. That's what you told me we're going to do. So that's what I'll prep. And I don't need to concern myself with the travel between the town and the ruined mill. Be like, or any of that shopping or any of that stuff. Be like, I just start them right outside. All right, you are at the ruined mill. You have traveled here. It's in the morning still. If anybody forgot that they wanted to do something before visiting the mill, we can always do the flashback if we need to after the initial scene. But as of right now, at the start of the session, you are at the ruined mill. What are you doing to investigate it? Go. And so that can really jump in and really kind of help them. And like I said, you really only get the opportunity to set that first scene. Let's say you've done it, you figured it out, you've gotten your one, we've got our road encounter in our example. So, might want to know, how many scenes do you need to prep? This kind of varies. Actually, it can vary quite wildly. But the true, I think, veteran Dungeon Master answer is that it's probably less than you think. And it's generally, players tend to get up to hijinks, to get off topic, to sessions are usually pretty slow. I think we all know that as sort of game masters, is that when we prep, how many times have you prepped for a session or adventure and been surprised how little of that content your players actually get through in a session? I mean, I feel like that's almost every session for me. I feel like I'm constantly over prepping, and I'm usually not prepping a ton. And the last adventure I prepped was, not including monster stat blocks, was like 1 page front and back. And they got through about a third of it. They completed the one shot, but they only went through about a third of the content. So it's like, wow, I really could have made this super linear, but I made a bunch of branching paths and loops and stuff for them to explore, because I wanted to let them have the option about like how they got to their destination. But if I really needed to, I could have really shrunk it down and made it pretty much a straight line, maybe with a couple switching paths, instead of making this sort of like big sort of double loop that I did of adventure locations for them to run through. So how many scenes do you need to prep for a session? It depends, right? The answer is depends a lot on the size and playstyle of your group. And that is not helpful information. I think we all know, especially for a new dungeon master. It's like, great, that doesn't really tell me anything. So, if we assume that you are 1 scene per 45 minutes gameplay. So, if you play a pretty standard 3 to 4 hour D&D session, and let's assume that you have a group of about 4 players, usually, kind of a standard party, that's about 5 to 6 sessions. Depending, for a 4 hour game, that's about 5 to 6 sessions. So, let's say that. Let's see. sessions, 5 to 6 scenes. Ooh. Scenes for a standard 4-hour 4 PC game session. So yeah, it's five to 6 scenes, which actually is not too much if you're looking straight at sort of building a very sort of specific scene that can happen. It's actually not very much prep. And if you're throwing combat, if you're going to have a combat heavy game, that number probably needs to go way, way down. But it is important to remember that fewer players move faster. More players move slower. So if you have a group that has 6 players in it, you'll notice the games probably take a lot longer. Whereas I ran a duet game a while back, which is of course me as the DM and then just one player, and they can crank through scenes in 15 minutes. Depending on what it is, somewhere between 10 to 20 minutes for a scene. Even sometimes fight scenes are very, very quick because they can't be very complicated or very large because there's only one player character. So by definition, they're going to be pretty quick. And especially with no sort of like assistance or support structure, players are much more likely in a duet game to, I think, run away or flee or hide or avoid combat if they can. Just because it's really tough to be a solo adventurer in D&D or most sort of RPGs. It's actually really tough if it's not built specifically to be sort of a solo adventuring system. But so fewer players move faster, more players move slower. That's something to keep in mind. Combats, let's see. Combats take the most time. And then exploration and social encounters vary by their nature. So if you're like, puzzles tend to take a long time. That's an exploration encounter that takes a while. Generally. Sometimes they'll solve it like that, and if you follow the channel for any time, you know that I have very specific issues with puzzles and why I don't usually include them in my games, and that's one of the reasons is that sometimes they can be solved like that, so prepping them as a scene is kind of difficult because you don't know if that scene's going to take 5 minutes or 50 minutes. So that makes it really difficult to know kind of how many scenes to have, because it could go really fast or it could go really slow. But most social encounters, if they're not big, don't take that much time. But if it's a very important thing, or they need to make a very important decision, or they need to find clues or investigate things, or maybe if you were going to do something that's like a courtroom drama kind of thing, or they really need to convince the ruler of this land to support them in whatever cause is going on, right? That can be a much longer social encounter scene, which is much more different than you run into 2 random goblins in the dungeon and you decide to talk to them rather than kill them. That, even though that's a social encounter, it's going to be probably by its nature much shorter than something that's going to be like a very long sort of dialogue or rhetoric or sort of courtroom kind of back and forth kind of thing that's going on, or an interrogation, something of that nature that tends to take more time, rather than just sort of a usual sort of like small talk, chewing the cud, trying to just get some basic information from an NPC that's in the area. That's usually doesn't take very long. So much that you might not even consider that to be a full scene. And we'll talk about some of that stuff later, how you can sort of add those things in. But let's keep going. So combat takes the most time, exploration and social encounters kind of vary, and you'll probably have a good idea, like I said, depending on what sort of the nature of those encounters are. A simple trap, usually not going to take much time. If you want a really sort of complicated trap, or a trap sort of like gauntlet, so it's sort of a scene that has multiple traps like in a row that they kind of have to run through, sort of Indiana Jones kind of style, something like that, then that might take longer because you have a bunch of different things or plates to spin in that sort of encounter, that scene. A lot of things to sort of manage, and a lot of things that your players might want to investigate or take a look at or figure out. So if you have if you have a group that's full of sort of like power gamers and slayers and those things, you know that they are not going to spend a lot of time on these exploration and social encounters. They're not going to spend a lot of time on that. They're going to focus mostly on these combat encounters. And like I said, if you run into that instance where there are two goblins in the hallway of a dungeon talking and players come upon them, you're going to know after you play with the group for a little while if they're going to try to talk to them, if they're going to try to sneak around them, or if they're just going to kill them. And two goblins, if you're not probably like a first level adventuring party, that's hardly what I would call a scene. That's not going to be much of a combat encounter. That's going to be done in a round, probably. So I might, if I wanted to include something like that, and I knew the tendencies of my players, that they're probably not going to talk to the goblins, I'm probably not going to count that as a scene. So, because they're probably not going to talk to them, they're just going to kill them. That's just going to take... Honestly, I might not even roll initiative for it because it's going to be such a trivial sort of combat encounter. And it'd just be like, yeah, you guys can roll some dice, but I mean, like, you're going to kill them. They're probably not going to do much, if any, damage to you before you kill them. If you're not like a first level party and there's only two goblins. Okay. Alright, so now we know sort of a total number. So we know for most kind of standard games, it's probably around 5 to 6 sessions. And that's going to be kind of dependent on... I'd even go so far as to say 4 to 6 sessions, depending on... Once you get a knowledge about your group and how fast they move through stuff and what sort of content they enjoy. Like, if you have a group that doesn't really enjoy combat is the thing that takes the longest, so they're more likely to get through more scenes. Because they're more likely to sneak around stuff, to do more exploration stuff, but you might find that they spend more time with social encounters. Maybe they talk to a lot more creatures and they have a lot more in-depth conversations, so you know that social encounters actually are the ones that take the longest with your specific group. But now that we have sort of an idea, we want to know sort of, okay, what scene should I prep? Like, if you only have so much to focus on, that's the thing I'd focus on first. Focus on that first scene. Because that's the only one you're guaranteed to know that is going to happen in your next session. Because you get to make that one happen. The rest of them, they're the things that you think are most likely to happen. But not necessarily straightforward what that's going to be. And yeah, what scene should you prepare? Sort of like an acquisition by experience. As you get more experience with it, that becomes really more obvious. The best thing that I can say is try to engage all three pillars. It's try to make sure that you have something that deals with each of those. Or if you have a group that really, really doesn't do exploration, I think a lot of sort of contemporary groups don't do a lot of exploration, a lot of discovery or investigation kind of stuff. You might not include that in your session prep if you're only prepping, like, let's say four scenes. You know that's how long it's going to take your group to go through. You might be like, okay, well, I'm going to do 2 combats, an exploration scene, and then maybe another exploration scene, or maybe a social scene, kind of dependent on their kind of play style and what they like. Instead of trying to force them to do an aspect of the game they really don't like. Like, you can maybe throw those 2 goblins in there as like an extra kind of thing, because you know they're probably not going to talk to those goblins. They're probably just going to kill them. And just try to remember sort of like from the initial scene, what do you think is the next likely thing to happen? Let's say we have that initial scene on the road. We have our dead horse and wagon there. We assume they're going to investigate it. That's sort of the first scene. Well, if that's the goblin ambush, there'll be the goblin ambush. And you can see all this sort of prep very much shows up in sort of Mind of Handelver. So it's like, okay, do they go investigate the goblins? That's one thing they could do. Or maybe they're just going to clear the things off the road and they're going to continue on their way. So it's a potential for them to get spiraled off into a side adventure. If you don't want to prep that as an adventure, that's one of the things that you grab. Something that makes sense for your parachute file, that I would grab from my parachute file and be like, okay, there's going to be some sort of like Cragmaw hideout. And get something that kind of gives that vibe. And throw that into so just in case they decide to go off on a tangent and they want to go follow that, they can go do that. Or do they want to, and so I'm not going to prep that, I'm going to get something else for prep in case they decide to go that way. So what I think they're going to do is just going to keep on the road. So that's what I think their next step is, based off of sort of the urgency that's maybe going on in the game. To see player 2's sister and what's going on with them. So I'm like, alright, so now they travel. What do I think is the next likely thing that they're going to run into in the road? Maybe they need to make a decision about which path to go. Maybe that's going to be the scene. Maybe there's a part where the road splits and they can either take one road that's going to take longer to get around, but there's a safe bridge across a river, and or they can go the short route, but it's got a ford in it, and they don't know, and they're going to have to make some checks to go across the ford, but it is going to cut some time off their travel, and so now it's an important decision for them to make if there's some sort of time element that's kind of going on with this adventure. Then we know that. So definitely if you have that timer element that's going on in an adventure, like there's a kind of a deadline that they need to keep in mind, it's really easy to make a scene out of giving them a choice in which they can choose something that's going to be faster or more dangerous, or slower, but is less dangerous. So if you give them that decision, that itself is a scene, which one do you think they're going to take? Do you think they're going to take the shortcut? If they take the shortcut, if they don't take the shortcut, if they take the bridge, let's say they take the long way around, is that a scene? Probably not, if that's the safer route, if we don't think that's going to be interesting. Not. I might take it, I might doodle out to the side, just like I did with the Cragmaw hideout kind of example. I might doodle to the side, hey, you know, maybe there's a troll under the bridge. I mean, that would be an encounter. But maybe there's somebody who's, like, taking tolls on the bridge. Some bandits or something like that. And it's like, that could be like a throwaway random encounter if they decide to go that path. And I feel like I want to give them some sort of content. Or if I just want to skip ahead with them. It's going to be bad. But especially if it's like a point, and it's a decision point, and then they're basically going to loop around back to the same point on the other side, that's where I think the next scene should be. So maybe I'll do that. It's like, okay, maybe that's when they get to the next town, and here's what I think is going to be happening in the next town that they might want to engage. They might want or need to engage with something that's happening there. Maybe they're under some sort of monster attack, and they can deal with that real quickly, and that could be like a one scene kind of thing, or maybe they're staying overnight, and maybe there's, I don't know, undead that raise up out of the graveyard and sort of attack the inn, or something like that, just to kind of give them something to do. And they can deal with that, and they can make it's like a encapsulated sort of side adventure that's really just kind of one scene. Just to kind of give them something fun. So it doesn't feel just like, oh, on the road, random encounter, the random encounter is zombies. Instead of being like, no, you're resting in the inn, and this is, you notice that, you know, the inn's heavily fortified, and people are in there, and then if you ask questions about it, people are like super evasive because they don't want you to move on. They're desperate for the traveler's coin. And so they're like, oh, you know, it's just defensible, or they play it off, and you can kind of play into that sort of eerie feeling about it. And then that can be its own sort of thing. Little full scene that they can figure out and deal with. So that's what we kind of look at. So then we're just trying to kind of go down the line. Okay, what do I think is the most likely thing that's going to happen next, or the choice that I think that they're going to take? And then make any notes for things like if they don't take this direction, if they go somewhere else, what do I think will happen instead? So that can be a good question. We're going full Mine of Phandelver. There's a goblin ambush at that wagon. That's what happens. Okay, what is the absolute fail state? I mean, I'm probably not gonna try not to TPK an entire party with goblins, even though, you know, the great infamy of that first scene for Mine of Phandelver is that a lot of first level PCs die in that goblin ambush. A lot of them. So if you think about sort of what the fail state is like, oh, well, they're probably going to try to, I don't know, capture them for ransom or something like that. They have other people sort of captured, right? Right? Isn't there somebody captured in Cragmaw Hideout? I believe so. It's been so long since I've looked at Cragmaw Hideout, but I think so. Since I've looked at Mine of Phandelver, but I think there's somebody captured in there that you can talk to, if I remember correctly. If not, you're going to be captured and put in there. So that gives them a new thing to go. It's like, alright, well, I'm not going to worry about that. I've got that side adventure prepped. and then I look at the adventure. If I grab my sort of like 5-room dungeon or whatever it is and look at it for that's going to be in the natural cave and be like, okay, this would be the area where they would hold hostages. Now I know that, and now I know like if they completely fail, goblins are going to take them and put them there, and then that thing will run itself. I don't need to do any more prep with that. I can just run it live. I can improv that live with that one-page adventure or whatever it is that I already have set up, that I already pulled from somebody else. That's the whole point of the parachute file. It's like, if something goes real weird, that's what we do. We jump in and grab that. So let's not focus on prepping that. Just let us know. It gives me the sort of comfort level to be like, okay, if something goes way awry, I've got something for that. And the great thing is like that sort of cave dungeon can work in so many instances. If they just decide to go completely off the rails, they can still just run into that hideout. It just won't be tied to anything they've done previously. It'll be tied to whatever rabbit trail they've decided to run down. So just keeping those minds in there, so you have an answer for these questions. Ask these questions of yourself and your prep and of your scenes, and then figure out what those answers will be, and then you're going to feel very prepared, even though that doesn't typically... It's not going to elongate your prep a lot. Just as long as you have an idea of what that answer should be, that's going to be really helpful for you. Right? We don't need to make hard prep for it. Just take a moment to consider what happens when X happens instead of Y. Simply thinking that will help you improvise the situation should it come up. Absolutely. Alternatively, you may find it's more likely that Y is the result of the scene that X gave you for your specific group of players. So like we said, we talked about this being sort of like a fail state. But you're going to know your group better than I know your group, certainly. So you're going to know, hey, if I give them... If they're not super combat-oriented players, and you throw a hard combat at them, you may think that it's more likely that they're going to fail the scene than succeed it. So maybe you focus your prep on them failing that scene. And then your answer to the question is really like, okay, so, but what happens if they succeed? That's the thing you start thinking about rather than... Because your assumption is they're going to fail. Rather than sort of the inverse, which I think is how we normally think about that. We assume that they will succeed until they don't. And then I think a lot of Dungeon Masters are kind of like, oh, what do I do? They didn't do the thing that I thought they would do. But it's always been my experience that the things that you think they'll pass with flying colors, that's usually the thing they end up stumbling on. And things you think that are actually going to pin them to the wall and kick their teeth in and they're really going to struggle with, that tends to be the things they just sort of glide past. So, expect the unexpected, I guess. It's helpful to at least answer those questions for yourself. To think about that and be like, okay, yes, this. So that can be very helpful. So what's in a scene? So we know how many scenes to have. We have a kind of a basic idea of what's going on in it. So what's in a scene? So you're doing that mid-adventure prep, and you have a goal line that you're trying to get to. This isn't something that you're just throwing off one at a time, like a one-time one-shot kind of thing. So what's in a scene? So, it's going to depend on your comfortability of improvisation. I ran a one-shot pretty recently where I was trying to really not do a lot of description for the room, so instead I just kind of gave myself like 3 details for each room and a general vibe, and just was like, hey, I'll just improv it when I get there. And, it worked out pretty well. I think it worked out pretty well. I actually, in a lot of ways, found that a lot more useful for myself, because I wasn't me trying to read like 2 or 3 sentences or phrases of description and trying to take it up off the page while I'm looking at my prep and then translate it and regurgitate it out to my players. I'm like, oh, we're in the city center, in the ruined city center. There is, I can't even remember what's a good idea. Let's say it's wet, so you can tell this, like, it's rained recently, cobblestones are slick, And then I can internalize that and be like, okay, if you guys try to do any sort of weird acrobatic hijinks or climb up buildings or something like that, just like let you know you're probably gonna have disadvantage on that because everything's slick and wet. It made it really easy to just kind of jump in and not really kind of focus on that. So it's going to depend on, are you comfortable improvising that? I think we all have that experience where we have to come up with things right off the top of the dome when we're playing games. It doesn't matter how much you prep, you're always going to have to do that. Think about your strengths. Where are you strong in improvising that? Are you good at coming up with NPCs off the cuff? If you're doing that, then you probably don't need to prep NPCs. If they ask you what the NPC's name is, and you're like, you always feel like you're a deer in the headlights when they ask you that, have a list of names. So that way you prep that, so that way you don't need it. And then just mark off names as you go down the list. Pretty easy. How comfortable are you, what's another thing? Improvising some sort of trap or hazard. If you're like, oh yeah, I can definitely throw sort of like a raging river in front of them or something simple like that, some sort of a magical device that's cast lightning lure or something like that. Like that's its attack action as a trap. If I feel really comfortable, I feel usually pretty comfortable about doing that. So I'll be like, oh, I don't really need to prep that. I can improvise that. So instead, focus on what you're not comfortable improvising. If that's room layouts and stuff like that, then that's things you want to prep. So only prep what you're not comfortable improvising, and then just try to improvise everything else as you will. Because the more you're able to improvise, the more able you are to sort of make the game react to your players and the actions of their player characters. Which kind of makes a more sort of tailored game than sort of creating... otherwise, you're kind of creating a form style of game, and they have to conform to what the game is that you've already prepped. Which is when we start to get into things like railroad territory, where it doesn't feel like they have a lot of choice or agency in things. It can often feel like that, even if they do have choice or agency in it. So that's really what you want to focus on, is sort of the improvisation of it. So here's sort of the things that I look for when I'm like, what's in a scene? So I'm usually wanting to know some location info. So that's sort of like a general description, piece of flair, and from least to greatest importance. Sometimes I don't actually make this last part, but it is useful for certainly newer dungeon masters, I feel like, until you kind of internalize this. It gives you the ability, when you're describing a scene that you're setting up, you can laser focus it the way you describe it to specifically what you want your players to focus on. So, general description, let's say, general description, let's just use that first scene again with the dead horse and wagon. So general description, you're down a sort of like an isolated country road. It's a dirt path. It's relatively narrow, not wide enough for two carts to pass. Kind of gives you the idea, and it's choked by woods on either side. So it's already gives you sort of that isolationist kind of feeling, like, oh, this is right. Kind of ratchets up the tension just from that basic general description. You want to add that piece of flair. That could be something simple as, like, you see a vulture circling overhead, right? We have the dead horse, so there's a vulture circling overhead in the distance, in the direction you're traveling. So there's a little piece of flair. It's just kind of a throwaway thing, just to be like, hey, here's just a little detail for you. And we're going to tie it in. And then from least to greatest importance, our challenge, our obstacles, our exits, our PC scenes, goals. In this scene, we don't really need to worry about exits, because we're basically like, you are on the road, it's choked by woods, it's either behind you or in front of you. We've already set the exits for you. And then sort of our challenge or obstacles, there aren't any immediately in this scene, except the only obstacle is that there is a dead horse and overturned wagon in the road. So if you're going to try to get through because the woods are so choked in. You're gonna have to figure out, if you're walking, you could just probably climb over it. But if you've got horses or a cart or a wagon with you, or some sort of vehicle, you're gonna have to get those things off the road. So we focus in on that first, and then we might want to pull it in specifically to the most specific thing for them to focus in on, is that in the horse you can see there are a number of arrows sticking out of the dead horse. Right now, the PC scene goal is like, okay, we have to get past this thing, but also, should we investigate that? Are we about to get ambushed? So it kind of funnels you towards specifically where you want the players to kind of focus. So general setting, little detail above. Choke in, be like, okay, here's the obstacle that's in your path. Choke in a little, zoom in a little bit more, and boom, there's arrows sticking out of it. Now we're on high alert. What do you do? So that's a good way to do it. So that's sort of how I do it. I think that this is very similar to the Angry GM's way of describing a scene, his sort of method for designing a scene, and I think it's super useful. I don't always need all this stuff. Again, I only prep when I'm not comfortable improvising, but if this may be like a really big set-piece battle or something like that, I might have some more concrete areas, because I want to make sure that it's more to make sure that I tell them specific information. Like, I want to tell them specifically the exits in this dungeon chamber. I'm going to tell you specifically the challenges and obstacles that you see immediately that are in there. And the piece of flair and general description are just kind of there. And you want to do that early on in the description, so they don't focus on, like, the vulture. Be like, you say, choked woods on either side, narrow path as you're walking. You see in front of you a vulture is circling overhead, and then that vulture, we went from general description to the vulture, and the vulture is going to pull our focus down to the ground, because we know that, of course, vultures mean that there must be some sort of carrion, there must be some sort of dead animal around, or some sort of dead body, and boom, we find it. Then it did its job, and it helped us along the way. So we did that, and I also want to know encounter notes. That's going to be anything like DCs, stat blocks for creatures that are in there, if I need them, NPCs for creatures that hopefully they're not going to fight, etc. Really anything that's going to help you. If you have some sort of traps or hazards in there, you want to make sure that you put those encounter notes in here. As well as I like the ICRPG room DC, so I like to set a static DC for an entire scene. I just set it for the scene, and then if I think it should be harder, then I add 3 to that number. If I think it should be easier, I subtract 3 from that number. So I just set a random DC. So let's say if I was going to do the this dead horse and wagon scene, I'd be like, it feels like it's pretty easy. I don't want it to be super hard. I'd make it like a DC 12. That's gonna be the scene DC. So if they want to go investigate arrows, DC 12. If they want to try to navigate their horse and make their horse jump over the dead horse, that seems like maybe a little bit more difficult if it's not like a trained war horse or something like that, so it gets skittish around like the smell of blood and things like that. And also you're trying to make it jump and it's not a jumping horse. I'm going to say, that seems like it might be a little bit more difficult. Also, I want them to engage with the scene. So I might be like, alright, so I'm going to add 3 to that. So it's a DC 15 animal handling check. Try to get this horse to jump over it. And then it's like, if you fail, you don't get over it. You try to go for a jump, and then the horse runs to a standstill, or does jump and gets over it, but you fall out of the saddle and fall on the dead horse, and snap an arrow as you fall on it. And kind of put them in the middle of it. Put them in the middle of the scene. So those are sort of the encounter notes. NPCs, so if there are dead bodies in the wagon, I probably need some information about what those are. Like who these people are. If they can have any discernible details, anything like that. And then, of course, loot. So that's any basic setup. So it's like, okay, where is the loot? So if we're like, this is pocket contents, so it's in the pockets of one of the dead bodies, and then you pull it out, and then that should lead to more questions. If you decide to put loot in somebody's pocket after they've been attacked and killed, they've got arrows sticking out of them, and be like, that's interesting. So whoever attacked these people didn't loot the bodies. Interesting. especially if you put something valuable in there. If they have a coin purse on them and they didn't steal the coin purse, just like a murder with somebody in real life, when you have a murder and the dead person still has their wallet, and you're like, okay, well, obviously not motivated by some sort of like robbery. Like they weren't trying to steal from them. It wasn't a mugging gone wrong or something like that. This was clearly something else. Some other sort of motivation for this murder. So that's sort of the things that I kind of focus on when I try to put together a scene. All right, what do I actually need to prep for the scene? What is the specific location info to kind of give the description of it and drill down to specifically what I want them to focus on? This is usually, by the way, the thing that you want them to focus on the most is usually going to be the challenge and obstacle. And this is a very important thing to remember with that, because that's usually, if it's going to be, if you're assuming a fight, like a combat encounter, if you're assuming that, then you want to make that the last thing you talk about. Because if you do that before you start talking about exits, players have a tendency to stop listening after you tell them that there are monsters in the room. So if you like, oh, you come up to this next room and you see orcs sitting at a table, and then you try to describe the rest of the room, your players are already looking at their character sheets trying to figure out what they're going to do about these orcs. And they're missing, like, hey, you should know this is the type of room they're in. This is where the exits are in the room. They'll miss that, hey, there's a big chandelier right above their head that's got a rope that's tied off nearby. They'll miss that. So if you're going to do something like that, that's why you want to focus on what is the sort of the most important thing. It's going to be, that's the thing you want to put at the end, because then if you put it in the middle, they'll tend to stop listening to what kind of happens after that. So if you're doing a combat encounter, mainly that's going to be like save that for the end, because that's what they're going to focus on. Because players have this tendency, I think we all fall into it, I know I certainly do as a player, is I'm listening to a DM or GM describe a scene, and I'm like parsing it as I'm listening. I'm trying to be like, okay, what's the important part of this room? You're describing it, so something must be important. So I'm waiting to hit like the highlighted, the bold word that's in there. It's be like, this is the focus of the room. So your players do that, and I think all players kind of do that to some extent. So you want to put that focus point at the end and not the beginning, so that way it doesn't turn into sort of Charlie Brown teacher, because that's what's going to happen after they key in on that important point of the scene. So that's it for that. So let's go back to the top. We'll just go back over everything really quickly. And then I'm going to take a short break, and then we'll come back in and kind of talk about a few little extra things. Talk about some of the little extra bits. We'll do some of that. Kind of talked about the controlling tempo and things about how to end the game, some bonus prep things, and some of that. So this will be sort of an overview. We'll sum it up. I'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll finish it up. All right. And that may be all actually right down. I may just kind of freeform the rest of it. It's not too important, and we can kind of focus on kind of the dialogue. So if you guys have any questions about any of that stuff, make sure to let me know. We'll address them. So this is about mid-adventure session prep. So you kind of have an already going on, stumbling blocks of other things. Kind of assumes that you're going to be prepping a new adventure, not prepping something that's already in the middle. So we want to focus on prepping on session prep that's for an ongoing sort of adventure string. So we start off with your question. So let's say, what is your character's intended action? And be real upfront. That you're asking them, hey, what do you want me to prep for next session? You guys are, let's say you're doing like a murder mystery kind of thing. It's got like a serial killer kind of vibe in a village. You're like, okay, you guys we're ending the session. You've just come across the second murder, this other person, and you're gaining clues off of them, and you've gotten some clues off of them. What do you got? And we're ending the session right there. So you've just found some, let's say, watershed piece of information. What are you guys doing next session? What's the next thing you guys are going to do? You tell me so I know what to prep for the next session. Just make it very clear about sort of why you're asking the question and what sort of information you want from them, and that you're going to hold them to that. So you tell me what you want to do, and then I'm going to hold you to that. Just so that way I don't have to improvise an entire session from start to finish. So, alright, you guys have just gotten this watershed clue. You found a... you take a ring off of the dead body, and you look on the inside, and there's an inscription that says, "To my beloved," from initials MJ. And you're like, oh, now we have a really juicy clue. Maybe who is MJ? And maybe you've got some names of people in town. Maybe you've got somebody in the town with a first name with M, and they're like, well, we're going to go chase down. This is such a common name, Melissa. To ask Melissa more about her connection with this dead person. And you're like, all right. So that's what you guys are going to do next time. And then I know that the first initial thing that I'm probably going to prep is being like them knocking on Melissa's door. And is Melissa there or not? And do they answer? Do they run? Are they not there? Are they missing? Are they... if they're... But I also shouldn't be like, if we go to their home, they're not there because they're at work. It'd be like, no, okay. We're just going to start you at the point... If we're actually going to talk to Melissa, we're going to start you at the point where you're talking to Melissa. And I'll just start the scene being like, alright, you guys got the clue. You ran to Melissa's house. You knocked on the door. Nobody answered. You jimmied the door. If you have a rogue in the party, you jimmied the door open, took a look. Noticed they're not in there. You ask around town. You're able to track them down and figure out where they are. And you are now approaching them as they're, I don't know, maybe they're a baker or something. They're out. They've got a flowered table set out by big brick stone ovens, and they're kneading bread, getting ready to make a new batch of bread for the oven, and that's what you walk up to. Go. So we can just do that. We don't need to do the running around and finding stuff. If the intention is that they will start the session interrogating this person, if they're not missing or something like that, then let's just jump right there. Your countdown timers. Okay, is there something else? The countdown timer for this adventure might be, is somebody going to get killed? Right, maybe we reset the timer every time for the murders. Try to figure out when the next murder is going to happen. Very Jack the Ripper kind of style. And then I'll write that session summary. It's like, okay, here's the things that did last time. It ended with you guys finding the ring with the initials MJ on it. And then we take a break. Take a day or two. We've got the session recap. We're just kind of like percolating, think about what happened in the session, what we think we might want to do in the next session, any things that maybe we want to change about the killer. Do we need to adjust some things about that? And maybe we're thinking about, okay, what if they discover the killer really too soon? I really want to get like another session out of this. Is there maybe some sort of red herring I can throw at them? You could kind of let that sort of background kind of percolate. What would the red herring kind of be? What would be a useful kind of thing? Something like that, if you kind of want to move them along that way. So we take that break. We try to get some physical exercise out. Try to touch some grass. Try to get outside. Try to get some sunlight. All that stuff's really good for us, not just physical but also mental health, which will kind of help your brain kind of do its background subconscious work on this. And we don't have to worry about forgetting that info. That's why we do the recap as soon as we can after the session. But we're not going to procrastinate. Like I said, I like to do mine about 2 to 3 days beforehand and jump in there and be like, okay, and now we know. We're going to do our prep, and then so that way that gives us time to review our prep before the game, and then also gives us the opportunity if we need to check in with a specific player or tell them some specific information that you forgot from last session. You can do that real quick over, text or Discord or whatever you guys use to communicate with each other. And you can do that to make sure that they have it, or you want to ask a question about something that's important about their character, because that's going to change how you're going to do some of the prep. You can do that if you need to adjust that. So what's actually happening in the session prep, the meat and potatoes? So we want to do that high value prep. We want to focus specifically on scenes, not on the handouts and the dynamic lighting and all that stuff's extra fluff. If we have time, we'll add that stuff in, but really we want to know specifically what are they going to do in the session. What am I putting in front of my players for them to actually do? So now that's going to be about 5-ish scenes if this is a standard sort of 4-hour game session with 4 players and yourself as the DM or GM. So we're going to do that. So we really want to spend most of our time on that first session. What do we think is the first thing we're going to do? So I'm going to really focus in on that interrogation scene with Melissa. If Melissa's there, does Melissa see them and she tries to run, or whatever happens? Somebody intercedes on her behalf, something like that. Anything like that. If maybe I come back and I'd be like, oh, actually the lord of the village has some. Maybe it's sort of like a Gaston Bell kind of thing where he desires Melissa, and he's actually now barring them from interrogating her, even though maybe she is or is not into it. Maybe they are lovers, maybe they are not. Maybe it's sort of a one-sided affection, and the noble themselves is sort of stymieing the investigation, and then likelihood is that your players are going to be like, oh, well, that's super suspicious, and going to dig into more of that and be like, oh, why is our lord protecting this Melissa? And maybe that noble's going to vouch for her and be like, oh, it certainly can't be her. Just trust me, it's not her. As the lord of the land, trust me, it's not her. And who knows? Depending on that adventure, maybe it is Melissa, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's the noble. Maybe it's not. So it could be sort of a who knows what's going on. I mean, it's your adventure, so hopefully you've already done the adventure prep. So we don't need to do that. This is session prep, not adventure prep. So you kind of already have an idea of who the killer is in this murder mystery, sort of serial killer kind of setup. And so all we're doing is kind of putting some obstacles and scenes in front of our players to help them get to the natural conclusion of that. So that's what we're focusing on. We don't need to figure out all the adventure stuff. That work should already be done at this point. This is a mid-adventure session prep. That's what we're focusing on. Alright, so we give them... we know that we need to focus on the scenes, or those encounters. We really want to focus on that first one. We want to spend most of our prep there, because that's the one that we know is going to happen, because it's the only one that we get to dictate the start of the scene. After that first scene, unfortunately, the players are in control. They have the reins, and they can decide to go do anything. So for us, we just need to focus on, alright, that's one scene. If I need 4 more scenes, based off of that interaction, what do I think is the most likely thing for them to do? Do we think that, oh, they're going to start talking to people about the noble's background and sort of like their relationship with that? Do they talk to somebody who's close to Melissa? They talk to somebody who's close to the recently discovered murdered body, maybe a family member or something like that. So that kind of gives us an idea of, okay, I think maybe this person is the person they would talk to next, depending on that, or depending on how this interaction goes, maybe it's this person. And so that kind of gives us 2 options of scenes that we can prep. And so and then we can use whichever one they choose. We can maybe sort of guide them back to one that we've already prepped, a different session, a different encounter, interrogation, or whatever. And so we just kind of go through that gating process, being like, okay, I think they're probably going to do this. If something goes really wrong, what would happen? And just as long as we give some thought to that, we'll be fine. And then noticing that, combats usually take the most time. If you're going to decide to do a combat, exploration and social scenes are going to vary by their nature. In this, we're going to do some pretty heavy interrogation, so it's probably going to be kind of a longer scene, because the player characters are going to have a lot of questions for Melissa and the noble, both. And that's first scene, so we expect that these interrogation scenes are probably going to take a little bit longer. And if they're running short, if they kind of run out of steam, you can always kind of help them along the way, maybe give them an intelligence check or some insight checks or something like that, to be like, hey, this is I think a piece of the information. You have both pieces of information, but you haven't connected them yet, and I'm going to kind of give you a little helping hand, so that way you guys have a few more questions for this, because I kind of want the scene to take a little bit longer. So, what scene should I prep? First scene is the most important. We want to engage all 3 pillars whenever possible. Try to make sure that there's some sort of combat that can happen, or at least an option for combat some sort of exploration, investigation, discovery thing that they can do, and some sort of social RP, people they can talk to. Sometimes that can even be intra-party. So if it's just something that you put a decision, you put the player characters in a position where they need to make a decision, and you want the conflict to be internal with the party about how they go about that. That could be as easy as going back to the example we did earlier about, okay, we need to make a decision whether we take the long, slow route with the bridge that's very safe, or we take the fast route that's maybe more dangerous. Well, obviously, the player 2 is worried about their family member, so they're going to want to take the fast one. So we might have some risk-averse people, some more wizened people in the party, and maybe they want to take the slow and steady route. They're like, look, we're going to get there. It's only a day's difference. It's not going to be that big of a deal, probably. So let's make that choice. Like, there's no sense if we get hurt or sidetracked or whatever, we're not going to get there on time anyways. And so they can have that sort of argument and conversation together, and that in itself can be a scene. And that would be a social RP scene, but that's all internal for the party. You don't need a bunch of extra NPCs. Maybe you can have a helpful NPC walk by, and they can ask them about and so they can maybe get some more information if they don't feel like they have enough information to make that decision because they don't know much about the forward aspect, about going the forward direction and what that would look like. We can do that. Have that, so some random NPC kind of shows up. Do you need to improvise that NPC? Are you comfortable improvising that NPC, or do you want to make sure that NPC has like some sort of potential physical description and a name, and how much information maybe they do have about that? If you don't feel comfortable improvising that, I would feel comfortable improvising that, but to each their own. I understand, especially as a newer dungeon master, and you're still very much growing that improvising muscle, that ability to sort of improvise and do things on the fly. That you might want to prep that. You might not feel comfortable at prepping. It's also useful to go back when you're done with the session, look at your prep and be like, which parts of my prep did I use and which parts did I not? Are there parts of my prep that I don't use? Then maybe that doesn't need to be part of my prep anymore. Like if you always come in, you're like, I always prep these NPCs, and then I either don't end up using them, or they go searching for an NPC that none of the three that I created kind of fit that mold, so I can't use them, and I have to improvise them anyways. Then maybe you don't need to prep these NPCs because they're not useful for you. We want to focus on things that are actually useful for our prep. So it is useful to go back and look at your prep, and if you see some tendencies about things that you definitely should have prepped or things that you definitely didn't need to prep, session after session after session, that you make adjustments to what you do prep. Because we don't want to waste a bunch of time either. Certainly don't have enough of that. After the initial scene, where do you think they're going to go? And then what's in a scene? The actual brass tacks. What are we putting down on the paper? What are the things that I need to actually make this scene happen? Only prepping anything that we're not comfortable improvising. So location info, like the general description, some piece of flair, some sort of little detail or dressing, and from our least to greatest importance, our challenges, our obstacles, our exits, our PC scene goals. We don't really talk about PC scene goals, but PCs are going to have a pretty clear goal. Now, in our interrogation example with Melissa, pretty clear the goal is to get more information. And so if Melissa decides to do a runner, and she runs and it turns into a chase scene, we know that their goal is not going to be kill Melissa. Their PC goal is going to be stop Melissa, capture Melissa, talk to Melissa, and get answers out of her. Our encounter notes, so any sort of DCs that we need for it, or target numbers, depending on the game you're playing. Stat blocks for any sort of creatures that if we think there's going to be some sort of encounter in there, if we think it might turn into a fight, right, I might have that noble stat block. Probably don't need a commoner stat block, that's pretty easy, it's 10s across the board, so don't really need that. Any sort of additional NPC, like I said, if you want that description, if you want to make sure they have names, if you want to have some sort of details or motivations, things of that nature, if you need those things, add those here. And then loot, if it turns out and they can find some sort of treasure or things that they want to pick up, where's the loot and what is it, the details of what it is, and then, of course, if they're picking up just straight cash, how much cash is there? How much coinage are they going to fight? So, yeah, that's all the meat and potatoes. That's everything for running the session, sort of right out. So I'm going to take a sort of a quick little bio break. We're going to come back and talk a little bit more about some of the fun stuff, some of the extra stuff, the stuff that we talked about. You know, if you want some fluff, and we're going to talk about tempo. We're going to primarily talk about tempos and some fluff, and then we'll talk a little bit about our bonus prep, and then we'll be done. I probably won't actually come back to this document. Everything that's in this document is, we've kind of talked about everything that we need to do. Most of the stuff that's coming after this is not stuff that we really need to write down. So let's talk about orchestrating tempo. So it's really important to orchestrate tempo because that's one of the big differences between an okay session and a really good session. And at least it is in my experience. Anyways, that's sort of been my experience, is that for the difference, that what elevates a good session to a great session is often a great ending to the session. And choosing where you end a session in the middle of an adventure is really important. Ideally, you want to end the session on a spike of tension, a cliffhanger right before something happens. That might be rolling initiative, opening a chest, tripping a trap, an NPC about to say some plot-shifting reveal, give you some sort of information, etc. So, we talked about in that example with the sort of the murder mystery is that the big sort of kind of information they get at the end of the session is they find the ring that's got the inscription on it. And that's where you end the session. It's like, oh yeah, so that's a great reveal, and then you have the woo moment, and then be like, yeah, that's where we're cutting it off. You'll have to investigate it next time. What are you guys going to do? You ask your question. Alright, you guys have discovered this ring. It's got this inscription on it. It has the initials MJ. What are you guys doing next? They're going to look through their NPC list and be like, oh, well, let's go talk to Melissa. That's the only person that we've come across so far who has a first... that we know of that has a first name that begins with M. Alright? That's what we'll prep for next time. We do our adjustments in the session. I do the session recap. We jump back in. But we're going to focus on orchestrating that great ending. So when you're trying to get to that important point, you need to sort of adjust some things. You've got some strings you can pull to kind of manipulate the situation a little bit to kind of get you to that ending point. It can seem sometimes that like pushing sessions to like that cliffhanger ending can feel kind of corny. I know I still feel kind of corny about doing it at this point, but the truth is that players like it when you as the DM or GM ham it up. So it may feel corny, it may feel weird to you, but just do it. Your players are going to like it. They're going to enjoy it a lot more than if you don't do it. Don't let your own sort of like embarrassment or whatever you want to call it kind of get in your way. Any sort of yeah, just don't get in your own way. It might feel a little stupid. Just lean into it. Feel stupid. Ham it up. It'll be fun. They'll like it. It's fine. Trust me, they're gonna like it, and you'll get over that. So a little theatrical flair in your DMing style goes a long way, and especially in how players remember your games. So don't be afraid to sort of yuck it up a little bit. But to get to that sort of great ending, you need to be able to sort of speed up or slow down the game session, depending on what you're doing. So we know sort of with our prep how long an average scene takes, and one of the things that sometimes I do, especially if I'm running a one shot, but you can do with any game in your session prep, is that if you know that the average scene takes about 45 minutes, or you have an idea about how long it should take your group based off of your experience with the group, how long it's going to take them to get through about everything, and you have the end goal in mind where you kind of want to end the session. I put time, I'll add timestamp to the scene's title and be like, okay, I want them to, let's say we were doing the dead horse example. All right, they did the dead horse example, and now the next point is right. They need to make the decision whether they're going to take the slow route to the bridge or they're going to take the fast route through the ford. So if I get to that point, I'll be like, okay, they should have gone through one scene. I think that they should be hitting this scene at about this time from the start of our session. And then once we get to that scene, and I'm looking down at my session prep notes here. These are not my notes. These are something else entirely. But let's just say I look down at my notes, and of course I use paper notes because I'm an old fogey. I look down at my paper notes and be like, okay, they're supposed to hit this scene at, say, 7 o'clock. Alright, what time is it? Oh, it's 7:15. So I'm a little bit behind the ball if I want to get all the way to the end, to my end point. So I need to quick pacing this up. So I don't want them to take too long on this scene. So that's one that might be like, okay, well, you see a helpful NPC if they start acting circular, or if they're not making a decision, I can throw some sort of like the threat of some sort of random encounter at them, or some reason for them to, okay, they need to go now. Or I can just be like, okay, you guys spend a bunch of time talking about it. What is your decision? We're going to take a vote right now. And that'll be the decision for which way you guys go. When do something that way. So that can be really easy. So that's one really easy way to speeding up. So it's also important to speed up because you need to respect people's time in general. If you say that you're going to run a 4-hour game, you don't want to run a 5-hour game. If people are expecting to be done at a certain time, that's the time that they expect to be done at. So try not to run sessions over. I haven't come across a group who's upset ending a session like half an hour early, but I have definitely felt table energy evaporate many, many times when you have a session that really runs over your sort of expected playtime. Like I've played in games where we've gone even upwards of like 2 hours over, and it just feels like such drag because we're at that point where a DM's like, well, I really want to do the boss fight. It's like the last thing. It's really not enough to like start a session with. It's the end of the adventure. So let's just go ahead and push on through it, and then that never ends up being like one of the big bad sort of like boss encounters that I remember. What I remember about them is that I remember that session that took, we planned for a 4-hour session and it was 6 hours, and I don't want to do that. Like I didn't expect to be playing D&D for 6 hours. I expected it to be playing it for 4 hours. So I've never come across a group who's upset ending a little bit earlier, but definitely going over. So it's easier to cut earlier than cut later than go over in your session. And you really want to stick that landing with a good cliffhanger or adventure completion. So if that's what you're getting to, like we just said in our example, you don't want to cut, if you need to cut to shorten time, you don't want to cut that last scene. You want to cut one of these middle scenes. So if we prepped, let's say we prepped our 5 encounters, we're doing our road trip. We've got through the first encounter, we've gotten through the second encounter, we're way behind. They took a lot of time making that decision, and I really struggled to kind of like push them forward to make that decision. So I'll be like, actually, I'm going to cut out this next little bit. So like maybe I was going to have some sort of a combat encounter or something happen if they, like I said, maybe we're going to have the toll bandits on the what they think is a safe bridge way, the other way. I'm going to be like, yeah, we're cutting that. They're just going to pass through the bridge. It'll be fine. I'm not going to worry about that. I'd rather cut that scene that's not particularly important to make sure that we get to the ending that I want to get to. If I want to get all the way to the end that I want to get them to. So I'm going to do that. So I want to cut, if we're going to cut to speed things up, we want to cut from the middle, not cut the end off of our game session prep. If possible, because we want to get them to that adventure climax, that cliffhanger point, that sort of tension spike, whatever that excitement is, and then we want to cut it there. So if we have that goal and we want to get there, let's cut out the stuff that's in between where we are now and that goal that we're trying to get to. And that's really helpful. Yeah, you can fast forward through many exploration and social scenes. You can scale down combats, remove them completely. Like I said, adding timestamps has been a real game changer for me if I really want to keep sort of a tight session that I know, okay, here's what time it is, here's where I want to hit this. am I far behind? Am I like more than if I'm more than like 15 minutes behind now, I start looking at, well, maybe I should cut a scene to get me there, because I'd rather get there and in the session 30 minutes early than get there and run the session 45 minutes over. Something like that. So that's very easy way to speed up the tempo if you want to get them to a certain spot. If you need to slow them down, like if they're going through stuff fast, and you're like, ooh, they're gonna get to the end of my session prep before the end of the session, so I want to slow them down a little bit. It can be a struggle to kind of come up with enough scenes to fill the space, especially in the prep area. If you're like, ooh, they're like if you're doing your session prepping, you're like, I need like 5 to 6 scenes for this session, and they're like, I'm estimating maybe 3 scenes away from the big boss fight. I need like 2 more scenes. It can be hard to kind of come up with those scenes, and use what I call sort of like the hiccup method, which is where I look at my list of sort of like potential scenes and I think about, okay, what could present itself as an obstacle to the group, some sort of hiccup as they pass from one scene to the next. Let's say in our example, we want to slow things down. I wouldn't just use a previous example, not that I think this is necessarily a practical example. If I need to slow them down between the dead horse scene with the wagon attack scene and the making the ford or bridge decision, if I want to slow that down to give them a little bit more time, like I want to end with them getting to the town where the sister is, be like, okay, what is something that could come up between those two things? Maybe I'd do some inspiration, maybe I'd look at some different random encounters, maybe some things that kind of happen to people, to common dangers that happen to people as they travel through. And try to figure out something from there. It could be trying to think of, like, maybe they reach a fork in the road that's got a signpost on it, but somebody's gone by and knocked all the like plates for the signpost for like different towns off it, and they're all laying on the ground, and they need to figure out, you know, where did each one go so they know they go the right direction, so they don't get lost. That's a pretty simple one to throw in there. That's just kind of pads for time. That's something for them to figure out. It's kind of like a puzzle, but they can use sort of in-character, in-universe skills to kind of deal with it. You know, people who have those carpentry tools or wood carving tools have better ideas about that, about trying to understand the wood and like maybe where its placement was and things like that. Give them advantage on that, some sort of investigation checks they can do. It's like a little exploration scene. They can wait. If they're really struggling with it, I can have another NPC traveler come by, and they can just ask the NPC traveler if I feel like they've played out too much time and I need to maybe get them. I went from not having enough time, or not having enough content to fill the time, to now I'm running behind, and now I can improvise. Oh, well, like an NPC can come along if I'm thinking about those fail states. Oh, I can have an NPC traveler come along and they can give them directions which way to go and can help them reset the signboard real fast. And then if they take the time to reset the signboard, I'll be like, oh, well, maybe I'll add that as a little karma thing down on our countdown timer. And, you know, maybe they'll get some good out of that in a future session. Be like, hey, you were the people who fixed that signpost. Here, have some money, or let me get your dinner for you, or your room, or something like that. It's like, or if they don't, you know, maybe they blame them for being lost, or who knows. Try to blame breaking the signpost on them. That would be a fun thing to do. And again, some sort of confrontation about that. So lots of fun stuff you can add there. So the PCs travel to adventure location. There's some sort of hiccup that keeps the PCs from getting on to their next thing. That's all we're kind of talking about. So, and that's a very sort of like overland example. If we wanted to look at sort of like a dungeon example, that'd be something like, alright, they're at the adventure location, and they're really close to the BBEG in the dungeon, and I need a way to stop them. And I'm like, alright, well, I can decide that maybe one of the dungeon passages they need to get through is collapsed, and so they either need to spend time digging that out or finding another path around in the dungeon. If you've got loops in your dungeon, that's not going to be a problem, and kind of force them to go through some other content that's in the dungeon to kind of get to where they're trying to get to. You can add some nasty traps or hazards, some wandering monsters, a weird creature to kind of talk to, or some sort of bizarre item or room to investigate. You kind of give them these little things to do sort of along the path. If you need to kind of stretch out your content to play it for time, you can do that stuff, which is very useful. And then one of the things that I like to do with prep that don't talk about too often is sort of inter-scene fluff or interactions. Like, I kind of touched on them briefly a little bit earlier when I was talking about there are things that I have sort of in my prep where we talked about where it's like this isn't big enough to be a full scene, but it is something that could happen or they could run into. This is really useful, especially doing that padding for time, or if you feel like the energy is kind of draining out of the group, and they're kind of getting that malaise. You feel like the energy level is kind of dropping at the table. You can kind of toss something in, give it to something. It's not enough to be like its own full-blown scene, but it's enough to kind of build up the energy again in the game, or give them a little something extra to kind of focus on. Usually for me, it's like a list of I don't know. It's anywhere between. I try to have probably at least 3 usually somewhere, but really kind of. Ideally, I like to have between like 5 to 10 of just this small list of random like fluff or quirky things that can happen, or potential interactions that make sense for kind of what's going on in the game session that I'm prepping out, but aren't big enough that they kind of warrant their own scene. They're helpful to toss in the game if the energy starts to kind of drop at the table, or if they need to, kind of like need to jingle the keys in front of your players to kind of get their attention back in there. You can have like one enemy step out, like one goblin step out, and they can have this interaction with one goblin, and it's kind of a throwaway encounter. It doesn't really do anything, but it kind of gets, if everybody's attention's kind of falling away from the table, it can kind of zip it back in really easily without having to kind of prep an entire scene or come up with an entire new scene to do that, which is really useful. Like for an example, in a game that I ran, I can't remember if I've used this example before or not in a video. Probably. In one game, I introduced a mind-controlled mouse that visited the group as they were finishing a long rest. The BBEG was using it as a way to sort of like spy on the PCs in the dungeon. They knew that there was somebody in the dungeon, and so they were using this mouse to kind of look around and find them. And found them, but they had this interaction where they tried to talk to it. Nobody had like beast speak or anything, or animal friendship or anything like that. Nobody was playing like a ranger or a druid, so they didn't really have access to those spells. So they were trying to sort of like do it Lassie style. What is it, Lassie? Timmy stuck in the well, and they tried to follow it as if it was like leading them somewhere, like helpful, and it wasn't. And then like once I kind of gave the BBEGs from like an intelligence check to try to actually I think it was an insight check to figure out sort of that the players were looking to it as sort of like a helpful creature. And I just had the creature kind of like lead them towards a dungeon hazard or trap in it to kind of like lead them towards it, and then just kind of scurry off and where they couldn't follow it anymore. So I just kind of used it to sort of to just kite them into danger, which was fun, just because they ended up deciding that, even though I wasn't telegraphing in any way trying to say like this thing is important, it just simply that it was watching the party and observing them with more intelligence and interest than a normal mouse would be giving them. And that was an easy way, and that probably took, that interaction probably took 10-15 minutes, so that's a very easy way to sort of like pad some game time if you need to with these little interactions like that. The one thing is try not to make them super random, which is certainly an issue that I've come across in some other DM's games. I try not to do it, and sometimes random is random, and random is okay. If you're kind of like out in the wilderness in the wild, it's usually okay, but sometimes Especially if it feels like it's like a reoccurring creature or something that keeps happening. It can be kind of weird if it's not tied to anything that's actually going on that the player characters can actively investigate or have any knowledge on. If they don't have any knowledge of it, it just seems random to them. And that can actually be more detrimental to your game than good for your game. So if you want to, but it is a good way to, these sort of interactions are a good way to sort of like do a little bit of exposition or world lore if you want to dump some stuff like that. It's a cool way to sort of like actively do it in these sort of like bite-sized chunks. These sort of interesting fluff and interactions are very close to the sort of lazy DM Dungeon Master sort of idea of secrets and clues. Very similar kind of ideas, but usually I try to make them pretty actionable, something that they can sort of jump on. It's not just sort of a basic piece of information, because that to me was never helpful in the prep. It's just having the information and then trying to figure out a way to transmit that to the players. Is more useful for me to do a little bit more and build like an actual interaction or thing that could happen for them to come across. I needed just a little bit more than the secrets and clues that's in sort of like the Return of the Lazy GM. And right, the idea is to give them somewhere between like 5 to 15 minutes of content, something for them to just kind of do before you move them on to the next sort of like proper scene. And like I said, it's a very easy way to not only, interesting fluff, like those little interactions are not only a great way to sort of play for time to pad your session a little bit if they're moving very quickly. It's also a very great way to correct or provide either provide new information that they've missed or they're going to need for something that's coming up, or correct information, something that they've gotten very, very wrong. They've misinterpreted something very, very wrong in the adventure, and this is a way for you to kind of like gently nudge them to be like, oh, this piece of information you have, or this assumption you've made about these pieces of information is incorrect, and here's something that kind of tells you that, which can be really useful, especially if you're doing that sort of murder mystery adventure. If that's the adventure you're in and you need to, and they've taken a red herring and they have convinced themselves and they're far off the field, they're way off the mark. Having one of these little inner scenes to just kind of throw it in and be like, oh, there's somebody who shows up who can immediately tell you that you're not on the right track, which can be very useful. And then, so that's everything for interesting and fluff. So the last thing I want to talk about is sort of that bonus prep. So low value. Low value as in that it's useful for managing or running the game, or administering the game. Not that it's not things that players like or that you like making. It's just that from a practical standpoint about running sessions, it's not usually the most useful thing. So that's what I have at the end of my prep sessions. Like, okay, if I was expecting to spend, let's say that it's a lazy Wednesday evening and I ripped through the prep pretty quick. Maybe I can just pull over some scenes that didn't get used in my last game, and so I thought, oh well, I had prepped from their end. I had prepped 6 scenes, and they were real slow that session. They only got through 3 of them, so I already had 3 scenes, but they haven't made like any deviation. So I'm like, I've already got like the next 3 clear scenes that I think are what is going to come up. I'll spend a little extra time fleshing out that first scene, that first strong start scene, and then I only need to prep like 2 more scenes, and so that might take like half my normal prep time. So I'm like, oh well, I've got a little extra time, so maybe it's time for me to look at some bonus prep stuff, some extra stuff I can throw in, especially useful for those mid-adventure kind of sessions to kind of keep the energy high. Oftentimes, if people are going to do handouts or any sort of tactile resources or music or stuff, they kind of like front load that on the adventure. But it can be really, really useful to kind of use that as a way to keep interest in the middle of an adventure when you're doing that prep, instead of just right at the beginning or right at the end. So here are some things that I would consider prepping if I had that extra time on my hands. Primarily improv resources. So for me, we've gone through my binder, but if you want to see what's actually in my binder, there's a video about that. You can find it on the channel and watch that. But it goes over some of these things more in detail and shows you how I use them. I've got some 5 drop-in NPCs, which are 5 sort of like more slightly more fleshed out NPCs. They've got a name and an ancestry, and they've got some like a physical description, some basic mannerisms. So if I just need an NPC that needs to be like important to what's going on, I can just grab that. So like if I said if I was they went and did the talk with Melissa, and then I decided like on the fly that I was going to make that the Lord thing happen, the Manor Lord thing happen, very sort of Gaston Bell thing. So I needed that Gaston character. I can just go grab one of those NPCs, and then I can read it very quickly. I can read the description to them, be like, this is who this person is, and now they have a good sense of it, and I have a good sense of who this character is, rather than just having a name or something like that. It can be, I find that more useful. And then as I use that NPC, scratch them off, and then I can prep new ones next time. So I might prep some extra ones if I have time, as well as a names list, if that makes sense. If I don't have one I'm already using, I might update or create some location relevant random encounter tables if I don't have those created already for the adventure, as well as maybe put together some tiny loot packages or pocket contents. So if they decide that the dead body that they just found, they want to loot the body and go through their pockets, and I'm like, well, I didn't prep for them. Really, the ring was the only important information. I didn't really actually expect them to kind of go through the pockets. Okay, that's okay. I have prepped these little tiny loot packets, which are like one creature treasures. They're like, okay, they have, items 1, 2, and 3 on them. If they're looking for it. And then it depends, like, are they rolling this body because they want the wealth off the body? Or are they rolling this body looking for clues, right? That's two very different motivations for what they're doing. So if they're looking for additional clues, then I might have a clue to give them. If not, then nope, you find this, but none of this seems particularly relevant, because you don't want them to focus on something that's not important for the adventure. So you're like, yeah, you look through them and you find, let's say a flask on the person, and it's got their initials on it, and it doesn't seem particularly relevant to as a clue for the adventure that's going on. You can't seem to tie it to any other piece of information. Just make it very clear. It's like, hey, don't spend a lot of time making assumptions about this thing, these extra things that you pulled off the dead body, because they're not important to the adventure. I'm just going to tell you straight up, because I don't want you to waste a bunch of time focusing on them. So yeah, those tiny loot packages, I would update the parachute file. We talked about that a lot. It's sort of 1 to 3 location relevant one-shot adventures for when my players decide to go off the beaten path, right? We've got that Kragmaw hideout one. We're going to pull out some of the other ones that I know that are in there right now. I have one that's for like a goat herd who's looking for lost goats in the hillsides. I think that's one of them that they can kind of get into if they want to get into it. And something else. Oh, there's like an orc fort. That's the other one. There's a fort, which may or may not be orcs, depending if that makes sense. I'll also, if I have extra time, kind of look at those handouts and tactile resources. This is when I start busting out those the maps and the miniatures or tokens, get ambiance, the music. If I use any sort of sound effects, do that sort of thing during that time. Where I feel a lot of those new GMs really struggle is they get into the hobby through very highly produced actual plays. And I think they get into trouble and really struggle with prep a lot of times because they focus on these bonus prep actions first instead of like the actual meat and potatoes of the game. Because it's very easy to not understand the work that goes into running a game of D&D if you're coming to it if your introduction to the hobby is through something like Critical Role or Dimension 20 or the Adventure Zone or anything like that. Is because you're looking at D&D from like an audience perspective, which is not how D&D is a game. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be engaged with, not necessarily watched. And so, you're in that audience member, what you see, you don't often really see the character sheets. You don't really often see the dungeon master's notes about what's going on. So what you see is this highly produced tabletop with either a virtual tabletop or tangible in real space tabletop that's got tons of like Dwarven Forge and miniatures and has this entire soundboard and like queued up music, not remembering that, like, hey, this is like a lot of the DM is not even doing that. Like, there's a lot of there's an entire team of people who are helping to produce this consumer grade audience experience, and you're watching somebody else do something, you're not doing the thing. So there's a difference. There's a disparity between being an observer of the thing and then being a participant of the thing. Just in the same way, whether it's like sports or something like that, it's a very, very different experience between being somebody who is, let's say, watching a sport, let's say basketball, watching basketball versus playing and or being like the coach for basketball. Very, very different experience. You're doing very, very different things. You are engaging with the game in a very different way, in the same way. So, but it can seem like that from the outsider when you're looking at that and be like, okay, well, that's what it takes to make a good session, right? You've got to be a trained actor and improviser. You have to have hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars of D&D swag product that you need to be putting in front of people, like custom DM screens, custom tables, a giant gaming table, perfect maps, an entire room full of Dwarven Forge to pull from, custom miniatures for every player character and every monster, and you need queued up lighting that changes with the mood that's going on, and background images and sound effects that get added in, and maybe you do like burning candles, like change the candle light, and now there's like scents as well, and you're trying to engage all those senses, and you have all these sort of important, like professionally produced, like handout letters that have hand calligraphied each individual letter and all that stuff. It's like none of that stuff is actually going to help you run D&D is the problem. It's not going to help you actually run the game. So that's why I'm like, you put that stuff at the end after you know how to run the next session, because that's the thing, is that we don't get the Matt Mercer, we don't get the Brendan Lee Mulligan like DM notes from behind the screen. We don't really get a lot of access to that. We don't know what they actually do on their actual prep, because this is all theater. Everything else that we see is theater. It's not the actual prep for the game. So it's important to kind of make that distinct. So unless you are running D&D or Pathfinder or whatever sessions as sort of a product for an audience, those sensory details are of much less importance than being able to just run good sessions. Because if you're able to run good sessions, you're going to find players. But if you make this highly produced things, but the actual meat and potatoes of your sessions are really bad, you're not going to have players, and people aren't going to want to play with you because you run really bad sessions of D&D or whatever it is. So let's focus on that, and then if we have a bunch of extra time, then we can pull in all this other stuff, all that sort of flair, all those garnish. It's garnish for the meat and potatoes, or dressings for it. So I think it is a case in point. Like, I think every successful sort of done actual play game master or dungeon master or whatever it is, they do all the stuff that we've discussed earlier. They do all that important session prep. They do that, right? Matt Mercer has those setup scenes, those boards of Dwarven Forge and stuff that they pull out. Like, that's already done. They have very specific things that they're trying to hit. And so the better that you get at sort of like those bare bones, fundamental layer of session prep and creating those scenes and encounters, the faster you'll be at doing the prep. And the faster you get at the prep and understanding how much you need to prep for a session, and as you get more comfortable improvising more things and not having to prep as much, you're going to have more time on your hands, and you can use that extra time to add in some of this flair stuff to make that sort of a more immersive game. But that flair kind of comes to the end, because without that good foundation of prep, all the flair in the world's not going to get you where you want to be as a game master. It's just not going to do that. You have to build the house before you start worrying about decorating its walls and putting furniture in it. So that kind of brings us down, and that kind of talks about everything I want to do. So the last little bit I want to talk about is the day before. So I said I did my session prep, and then the day before, what am I doing? I've reached out, and if I haven't reached out to the players that I need to talk to, I'm going to do that now. Hopefully I've already done that, and I've gotten their answer back. If not, I'm going to remind them, like, hey, just letting you know, I still need this stuff before the session tomorrow. Like, if you have any insights, otherwise it's just going to be whatever it's going to be. I like to scan my prep the day before just to give it a once-over review. Just kind of look at it and be like, hey, is there anything that, like, some big, now that there's been a little bit of time, is there any sort of, like, big gap that I'm missing? Is there something that I forgot, something I skipped over, something like that I need to change and bring back? Anything that I want to revise about the creature encounters? Sometimes I do that. I like to have the day before check, because then that's of course invariably when you have the players like, oh, actually I can't make it to tomorrow's session. Like, okay, well, let me go adjust all the creature encounters, all the potential combat encounters down by 1 PC, so I can make that adjustment real quick. And me personally, I'm old school. I like to print my session prep. Like I said, my last game that I ran, the session prep without the combat encounters, like stat block stuff, was only a page front and back, and then the second page front and back were creature stat blocks, just so I had them just in case. But very simple. Doesn't take too much time. Honestly, it takes more time to type it out for me probably than it does for me to actually handwrite it out. But I like having the typed out ones, so that way it takes up a little bit less space, and there's easy to kind of scribble notes on, and I can track hit points and stuff straight on the sheets, and I don't need to worry about it, and I don't have to worry about, like, futzing with a big laptop or a tablet or something while I'm also trying to run the game. So it just kind of takes a lot of barriers out between myself and the players, and any distractions and things like that. So yeah, I like to revise that. I like to print out my session prep. This is usually also, if I haven't done it already, hopefully I've done it. I'm going to double check my DM Binder sort of parachute file to make sure I don't need to swap anything out. Through, like, oh right, last session we were in that hills area, and now this session we're going to do that travel, and that's in a wooded area, so I need to swap out some of these, maybe one of these that doesn't work. Like, I have the cave system, or it's choked wood, so, like, maybe we'll take the orc fort out, because there's probably not a large enough open area for there to be an orc fort, so let me go find some other sort of forest adjacent adventure-y thing to do, and I'll pull that in. We'll do that. Maybe it'll be like a fey hedge maze or something like that, and pull that in as a potential thing to worry on. But that's sort of the last day, and that's about it. So that's the conclusion. Kind of what I want to focus on is really get the foundations down good. You want to focus on those scenes. 5 to 6 scenes, depending on how long you run and how many players you have, is really kind of the sweet spot, I find. Usually less is more. Which really kind of fits on. It tells you, like, why the 5-room dungeon's so successful, because, right, it's got about 5 scenes, and that's about enough for a normal session. And then sometimes I like the extra 6. It's just like an extra, just in case they move through something really fast. Or usually that 6th scene that I do is kind of an aside scene, like it's kind of like a extra scene just in case I need it kind of scene. And it will be the scene that I will cut first from the prep. If I've got it, this throwaway scene. If I don't need it, then it's very easy to cut, and then to get me to where I need to be at the end of the adventure, so I can end on that sort of cliffhanger, them revealing that new knowledge, and especially if this is a mid-adventure one, getting them in that middle section where energy can kind of dip in a game, in a campaign, so really kind of focus on getting that peak right before the end of the session, cutting it there, so that way we know exactly what they're going to do next time, prep from there, and you should be good. If you do this stuff again and again and again, it becomes really, really easy, and those really, really successful dungeon masters are the ones that kind of figure out their prep system and understand how little they need to prep, which is really the ideal that we're looking for. Is how little amount of prep can I get away with, and allow myself to improvise more, to really customize the game specifically to my players, and not have to have it set in stone beforehand. To do that, understanding tempo, being able to speed things up when I need to get to that ending cliffhanger, and how to slow the game session down if they're really churning through content and I don't want them to get outside the stuff that I've prepped. So controlling that is very important. And that's about it. If you do those things, you're going to be successful, and if you do them over and over again, you're going to get faster at it, which allows you to bring in more of this bonus prep flair stuff, which will add a lot of depth to your game, but we don't want to do that at the cost of the meat and potatoes, like the real foundational structure of our good games. We got to have that first, and then we got to do that candy coating on the outside. M&Ms aren't a great candy if they didn't have the chocolate in the middle. If they were just a an empty candy shell, they wouldn't be a very popular candy. But because they have the chocolate in the middle, they are a popular candy. And again, that candy shell is real thin. It's mostly chocolate, right? Well, that's going to be it for me. Thanks, guys. It's always fun kind of running through this stuff. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. We'll take a look at them. Other things to talk about, we have the blog, redragonfiend.com. We've got some other videos on the channel, so check them out. We've got a whole playlist of this sort of like DMGM advice. Kind of talks about this sort of stuff, so if you like that, that's interesting. We also have the solo RPG series, so if you want to see a lot of this stuff like in play, a lot of this advice in play, I run a solo game on the channel, which is a lot of fun. They are currently getting their butts kicked through a dungeon, and this is all, it's a 5e solo play, so if you're interested in 5th edition D&D and you're struggling to find players for a game, or maybe you're not comfortable DMing a game yet, this is a good way. I think solo RPG is a great way to sort of make the transition between 100% player to maybe you're interested in DMing but you're not feeling super confident. I feel like solo adventures in your game system is a great way to get to know the game system really well, and also a good way to like start honing that sort of DM craft, like start honing that ability to be a dungeon master or game master as you're basically doing it for yourself, and really focusing on using that improv muscle and building that up, so you can start to understand like what you need to prep and what you don't need to prep for sessions. So that's really useful. You can check me out over on X, Red Dragon Fiend. We have a coffee and we have a DriveThruRPG shop, both for Red Dragon Fiend. So if you want to support us monetarily, that's great. Thank you. But also liking, subscribing, and of course sharing. I think it's the most important thing. So share this content if you like it out on Reddit, Ian World, or your other preferred role-playing game forum, Order of the Stick, D&D Beyond's forums, and wherever you go to talk about tabletop role-playing games. Just drop the link in there. Of course, any sort of social media is always helpful. Helps sort of bring people's attention to the content, so that way we don't have to make too many sacrifices of sheep on the altar of the almighty Google and YouTube algorithm. That's always helpful. But that's going to be it for me. Next time we're going to play, should be next week. I believe we're going to jump back in and do the solo RPG. We're going to see what happens from there. Otherwise, hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Alright? Bye.